Hey, this is Chris from Comics, Beer, and Sci-Fi. I'm here with Mr. Jason Moore, accomplished artist, and we just wanted to ask him a few questions on his career. So, Mr. Moore, how'd you get started in the industry?
Well, I'm from Flint, Michigan, and when I was about 16 years old, I met a local comic book artist. At the time, I had no idea that you could even do comic books if you didn't live in New York, because that's where Marvel and DC were at. His name was Randy Zimmerman, and he worked at a local comic book store. And I called the comic book store, asked him if he was there, and he was. And so I brought over some of my artwork over to him. It was just in a sketchbook, because I didn't know how comic books were created at the time. And Randy was already working in comics as a professional. And he kind of took me under his wing, thought that I was good enough to kind of be like his apprentice or whatever. Showed me, actual comic book pages that were, 11 by 17 and the type of tools that were used to make them and everything. And I became his assistant, his inking assistant, like inking backgrounds and stuff like that. And eventually, after a few years, I kind of spread my own wings and was starting to get feelers out there and putting samples out there for other publishing companies and kind of getting inking work on my own. And then it just kind of went from there, and I ended up working for Caliber Press and Malibu and Chaos Comics, Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, pretty much everybody at this point. Yeah.
At what point in your life did you realize that your passion was art, drawing, comics, and that whole type of genre?
Well, it's kind of like the old cliche, my mom says, you started drawing as soon as you had a crayon in your hand or whatever, and I would just, as a kid, I would play with my He-Man and Masters of the Universe toys, and then I would draw. If I wasn't playing with them, I would be drawing. In school, I always took art class and everything, and that was that was the one grade where I got an A. When I realized that I wanted to be a comic book artist was I think it was in '81 or '82, when my uncle got me my first comic books for my birthday. It was Swamp Thing number 19 and Blue Devil number 4. And I tore those things apart, reading them back and forth and trying to recreate the cool panels that I saw in there. And it just hit me at that age that, when I realized, oh, wow, these are drawn by people, because you see a comic book, a lot of kids don't realize, oh, the people create those, So I took comic books into my art class in high school, and luckily my art teacher was very supportive of it and thought that, it would be a great thing for me to look into. And he helped me, along, the art path for learning how to do that stuff as well. Yeah.
Now, kind of a funny question. Did you ever get in trouble for doodling on your homework or doodling on a test or drawing when you were supposed to be paying attention to an assignment?
Yeah, there was some times during parent-teacher conferences where they, I noticed all these drawings on his test, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, yeah, for sure.
How did you get, or what was the pull for you to get primarily into the horror genre?
I used to go, I live in Flint, and my Uncle Tom lives down in Pontiac, and I would go down to his house, for a couple weeks at a time in the summer when school was off. And he would always have these crazy movies. I mean, this was when I was like, this is probably like 10 years old, I'd go down there, hey, I got a show for you to watch or whatever, and it would just be the craziest horror movies, and I'd be scared to death, but I loved it, and one of the first, I could remember, it was a double feature one night with him. He had two movies. He's like, you got to watch these. One was The Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead, and Gates of Hell, which was an Italian horror movie by Lucio Fulci. I watched those movies back to back, and I was never the same since. I was a hooked horror fan, and that's really what started my interest in the horror genre.
So are you primarily self-taught? Did you go to school? Did you have a tutor or anything of that nature to kind of get where you are right now?
Mostly self-taught. I just had basic school, high school art classes and stuff like that. I didn't go to college or any particular type of art school. As far as, learning how to draw for comics, that was Randy Zimmerman taught me how to do that stuff, But overall, for art overall, it was just self-taught, looking at looking at artists' work that I appreciate and really admired and trying to copy their drawings. How do they draw this way or get this kind of line work or whatever, and just trying to mimic that. And that's really just, there's nothing wrong with copying. That's how you learn, because you learn how forms are built. You start out with basic forms and then build on top of that. And, a lot of people, young artists, feel like they shouldn't copy, like that's cheating or something somehow, but it's not. It's a good way to learn.
Yeah, a lot of teachers and artists today, especially in college, they kind of discourage it. It's almost a pretentiousness that comes from that. So let me ask you, before we wrap it up, who were your influences? Who did you want to be like, or who was your favorite artist growing up?
Probably the first artist that I put a name with the art style, because a lot of times when you're a kid growing up or you're first finding out about comics, you don't really put the name to the style of artwork. Like you might see Jack Kirby artwork, but you don't know the person's name. The first person where it kind of clicked and I realized, oh, this is the guy that's actually drawing this, was Bernie Wrightson. And as soon as I realized, Bernie Wrightson was drawing Swamp Thing, I wanted to find out, what else has Bernie Wrightson drawn? And I remember going to my local comic book store and asking if they had any other comic books by Bernie Wrightson, and luckily the comic shop owner knew who he was and gave me a couple, beat up comics out of the 50-cent box or whatever, And Wrightson was probably the first artist that I was just enthralled with and wanted to mimic, and I wanted to be Bernie Wrightson. And then researching him, I found out, he was influenced by Frank Frazetta and, Hal Foster and the old school guys, so I started learning about those guys and really finding an interest in the artists that were prior to Wrightson as well, the people that influenced Wrightson. So, but I would say Bernie Wrightson was my first big influence, and then, it just goes down the line of Frank Frazetta, Gashley Graham Ingalls, Al Williamson, Mike Kaluta, Mike Plug. Just I could go on and on, But yeah, that kind of 60s, 70s horror genre, fantasy genre type artist. Yeah, the old EC Comics, big influence. Yeah.
And last but not least, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen in the industry, and what is your advice to aspiring artists and people who want to break into the industry today? Because I know there's been changes.
As far as creating artwork for comics, it's a huge change because, back in the day when I was first starting out, way before me, everything was done traditionally with, pencils, erasers, Bristol board paper, brushes, ink. And, when you got the artwork done, you had to FedEx it to the publisher. And sometimes those boxes would get lost and you might have to redraw a page or something like that. And there was a lot of time spent, creating the artwork in the traditional way, where nowadays I would say the large majority of comic book artwork now is created digitally. That cuts out, that makes it a lot easier if there's any kind of editing that needs to be done. Somebody's looking the wrong way in this panel, you got to change their eye direction, or they're holding something in the wrong hand, or so. It's a lot easier to make those changes digitally than it was back in the day in a traditional method where you'd have to redraw the whole panel or use whiteout or whatever. And it also cuts out the whole rushing to the FedEx location before they close to get your package out so it can get to Marvel or DC the next day, because now everything is just uploaded to the cloud, and it's so the digital aspect is, I would say, would be the biggest game changer that I've seen in my career so far as creating the artwork for comics.
Well, all right. I really appreciate your time, Mr. Moore, and it's been a pleasure. This is Christopher from Comics, Beer, and Sci-Fi, signing off.